Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here. I haven't been at a Legacies at Lunch for 8 years because 8 years ago I moved from here to work at the Lakeport Plantation. So I haven't been back since then. I've been to the library several times. But it's good to be back. I'm glad so many people came out to hear this. But I now work at the Lakeport Plantation, which is this 1859 structure. It's an antebellum home on the Mississippi River in Chicot County. And it's owned by Arkansas State University. And we have 4 sites in total. We have Henry Pfeiffer House in Piggott, the Southern Tenant Farmers Museum in Tyronza, and of course the always popular Johnny Cash Boy at Home. And that's not Johnny Cash's Boy at Home. That is the administration building for the Dice Colony where Johnny Cash was. But that's also part of the site. But I know there's a lot of familiar faces out there, so I know some of you all have been to Lakeport, but for those of you that don't know where Lakeport is or don't know where Chicot County is, it's down here in the corner in Chicot County, just south of Lake Chico, the largest oxbow lake in North America and the largest natural lake in Arkansas. It's very close to Greenville, Mississippi, not too far in front of the border with Louisiana. But if you were going to drive there today, it takes about 2 hours and 15 minutes or so. And if you went down there right now, it looks like this. There's cotton growing in the field right in front of Lakeport. There's also the new Greenville Bridge is just behind the house. So it's on your way somewhere. So people who visit us are often on their way to New Orleans or to the beach. And if you come back in September, it'll look more like that, with cotton growing out there. But at Lakeport, we interpret the house and the people that live there. So we put exhibits in the house 5 years ago. They don't really photograph very well, but they're great to visit. But that's one of the exhibits in one of the parlors right there. But the exhibits explore the people who lived and worked there, and then also construction, the craftsmanship of the house, and the restoration of the house. But mostly what I'm talking about today is that how can we better tell the story of the enslaved people at Lakeport and the region? How can we tell their stories using their voices in slavery and freedom? And that's been harder to do than to tell the story of the people the White Johnson family that lived in the house. Traditional primary sources for slavery. You can get online today and go on Ancestry or Fold3 or archive.org and find the slave schedule, and can't find the tax record of Chicot County online yet. But you can find these slave schedules and you get the number of slaves that were at Lakeport or neighboring plantations. But there's also, all these kind of resources here at the top are mostly from the perspective of the owner. And they'll tell us something about slavery at Lakeport, but it's not the whole story. So I've been trying to find new sources that can hopefully tell me more stories. I haven't been 100% successful, but I'm looking for these answers. So I'm going to tell you more about these things that I've found. We have tried doing oral histories with descendants, and those have been good at looking at the 1920s and 30s and 40s, but they really don't reach back into slavery, really. But I may be able to later on connect some of these sources together as well. WPA narratives are another, and then what I'm mostly going to talk about towards the end is these pension records for U.S. colored troops I've been looking at for the past couple of years. But here's Lakeport again. It's built for this couple right here, Lycurgus and Lydia Johnson. They had been in the county since the 1830s. Their fathers preceded them by a few years. But the house is built for them. They were a Kentucky family, came from Scott County, Kentucky. And we can create kind of a brief timeline based on them at Lakeport and some of these records I mentioned earlier. But Lycurgus' father, Joel Johnson, comes to Chicot County in 1831, and we know from sources that he brought 23 slaves with him. At that point, I say he's the largest slaveholder in the county. I think that's right. His oldest son, Lycurgus, is in the county by 1837, based on courthouse records, buying land. In 1846, Joel dies, and we know there's 95 slaves at Lakeport. Lycurgus he's on a plantation a little bit further south. He also owns 95 slaves 4 years later. Lycurgus gets control of his father's land in 1858, and eventually builds his own house at Lakeport the next year in 1859. So in 1860, we have census records that say there's 4,400 acres of land in the plantation, and they're producing 1,300 bales of cotton, and there's 155 slaves on the plantation. I didn't put on there, 1858, we also have a list of names by list of slaves by name on the plantation, and I think there's 183 names on that list. So the numbers kind of vary, but they're in the mid 150s, nearing 200 in the late 1850s. And we know from tax records the number of slaves differ a little bit. We've got 104 in 1861. I guess tax records and census records are a little bit different. Ones are tax records, ones are counting people. 1862, the number is 120, and then during the Civil War, the number declines to 24 slaves and stays that way in 1864. And of course, there's no slaves in 1865. But we do see that Lycurgus' personal property tax dropped substantially from $171,000 to $18,000 because most of those slaves were property and you can no longer count them as taxable property. And then we know in 1870 that there are some former slaves that are still sharecropping at Lakeport. So here, this is an 1839 map. It's a much larger map, but Lakeport is right here where it says Joel Johnson. Lycurgus is further south right here. But you see all these names along the river, especially on the Mississippi side of the river, all these planters that had arrived from Kentucky especially. This is Kentucky Bend right here. We've got Henry Johnson, our brother there. Benjamin Johnson, the first federal judge in Arkansas, is another brother of Joel who's in the area. Ambrose Sevier, Ben Johnson's son-in-law, also has a plantation on Lakeport in the late 30s. He's Arkansas's territorial representative and later a senator from Arkansas. And then up here on Lake Chicot, there's a series of planters, and there's this guy right here, C.C. Stewart. And I found this quote by Charles Stewart, written in 1835. He's writing back to Virginia to another, I guess, investor, a relative, and he says that Chicot County is that delightful clime flowing with cotton and money, as well as milk and honey. So it's a wealthy place where you can make a lot. Where it's a rich place where you can make a lot of money off of cotton and slaves. And so that's what's going on there in the 1830s through 1860. You can see the population. It grows from 1,200 to over 9,000, and almost all that growth is the number of slaves in the county. By 1860, there were the percentage of slaves in the county is 81% of the population, so it's a higher percentage than any other county in the state. I think Phillips County had more slaves, but a larger percentage of whites there. And you can see that production of cotton is up to almost 41,000 bales, which I think is the largest in the state for that year. And if you just put these in graphs, you can see it goes up a lot. So that's what's going on here. When the Johnsons are arriving and other planters are arriving. And you can look at this on maps. This is cotton production in 1821. There's cotton production in 1859. The Chicot County's kind of on the edge of this giant production of cotton here in the lower Mississippi Valley. And of course, if you translate that or just compare that with slavery, it's the same map essentially, although mapped a little bit differently. So that's some context. This is a map that geographers often use to show the change in landscape for plantations from before the Civil War and after the Civil War. And so it's very centralized. This is in Georgia. It's very centralized with the master's house and the slave quarters nearby and the gin house not too far away. And then everything gets decentralized after the Civil War, where you no longer have gang labor with slaves. You've got sharecroppers that are making their own, they're basically families that are making their own contracts with the landowner and working their own sections of land. So everything gets decentralized. And so we did probably expect that Lakeport would have a similar landscape. And it kind of does. Well, it's a little more complicated because Lakeport had kind of two central houses. This is what we call Lakeport today. But in 1860, there was a second Lakeport. It was the father's house, which was down here, Joel's house. So we think everything, based on doing kind of some very basic archaeology that Stuart Abernathy led a few years ago, we think the slave quarters were south of what we call Lakeport today, next to the father's house down here. And then this section of land right here is called the Gin Lot, still owned by Richard Johnson, who lives in Texas. But in 1860, the river was closer. I say the river there, and the river's way out there now. Not way out there, quarter mile away or so. We also had this, as late as the 1970s, there was a section of homes, or a series of homes north of Lakeport that people called the quarters, but based on the archaeology, we don't think those structures dated before slavery. I think they were part of a later building. But they were kind of centralized for some reason. We're not quite sure why. But we also have a 1936 aerial of the plantation too. And you can see how the land is divided up in all those squares for sharecropping, unlike it is today. Now we no longer have sharecropping. We've got giant machines out there. But in 1936, when the Danzers were living at Lakeport and managing the place, you can see that the land is divided up for sharecropping. But again, here's Lakeport. I got these. Yeah, here we go. Got them labeled. The gin lot is there. I think the slave quarters are here or were there. And then the other quarters in quotations are up there. And for a while we thought that maybe this map was showing us Joel's house. But we found some letters recently from a relative from 1914 that mentioned that that the house that she had once lived in is now in ashes. So this can't be Joel's house in 1936. There's a newer structure there. Anyway, that's the landscape of slavery and post-slavery. Slave quarters don't really survive. We had this one structure on the premise that we think is probably the slave quarters. It was moved and put there in the we think probably 1960, and used as a shed. We did dendrochronology on the house, and did dendrochronology on the structure. The house information was conclusive, the 1859, but the tree ring guys couldn't get good enough samples off the structure to date it. But it's probably one of those quarters that were on the plantation in 1860, or maybe another nearby plantation. It's hard. Now, the Ford family lives there. Don't remember exactly where they moved it from. But we can also look at Lakeport and talk about the architecture and how that relates to slavery. And we have these are Habs drawings that were done in 1984 by architecture students from the University of Arkansas. You can find these online on the Library of Congress's website. But the front of the house was different than the back of the house. The front of the house has tall doors and crown molding and faux grading on fireplaces. And in the back of the house, the service area is where the kitchen was, where the servants' bell system was, and this is the area where you would see where the house servants would have been. Not all the slaves, but just the house servants. And this is another look at the house. What's the thing that's unique about Lakeport, though? A lot of houses that would have been Lakeport size would have had two staircases. We only have one staircase, and it's in this cross hall right here. So you walk into the entryway right there, and you don't see the staircase. You don't see the main staircase. It's not out in the open. They're not showing off with their staircase. And you can see it, the staircase over here in this cross section of the house. Houses our size typically have one staircase out in the open or in the cross hall, and then a secondary one for servants in the back. And for some reason, the Johnsons didn't do that. Either they were saving money or they were trying to control airflow. It's not exactly clear why we don't have a servant staircase. There are other family homes across the river that are built very similar to Lakeport that all do have servant staircase. And one of those actually had the staircase in a cross hall and a servant staircase in the back. So there's a precedent for putting it in the cross hall. So there's just a picture of the back of the house where the kitchen is, that service area. But we also have, there were servants, there were house slaves that worked in the house, and there's a remnant of this with these servants' bell systems. This is the only full set of original hardware in the house. It's in one of the parlors, but there are four of these, and two of the parlors, and one in the reception room or music room, and one in the master bedroom upstairs. But these would have pulled wires that went through the wall. There it is before restoration. You can see this channeling in the wall where these tubes, where the wires for the tubes led underneath the house, and then back under the house up to where the kitchen, where the bell systems should have been. And there's some of the remnants, there's that hardware, and this is some of those wires and little rockers that we found underneath the house, which is pretty neat. And then we think that the bells rang above the kitchen door up here, and you see this panel right here, that panel hid the wires for the servants' bells, we think. And the bells would have looked something like this right here, from this hardware catalog from, I think, 1865. It shows something very similar. And you can't really tell in this picture, but if you come to Lakeport and look above the door, there's about 3 places where things look like things have been attached above the door. It's likely where the bells were attached. And then when you get into the kitchen, This is the stove that's still there, the original stove, that we can date to 1860 based on advertisements from the company. It's kind of hard to tell in this picture, but it says Wallace and Lithgow, Louisville, Kentucky right here. So the Johnsons are going back to Kentucky to buy fancy stoves for their house and of course for their slaves to use. This is an 1861 advertisement for the company, and you can see the stove is almost identical to the one that we have. So this is not an 1880 stove, it's an 1859, 1860 stove. Back to our sources, our written primary sources on slavery. I mentioned the slave schedule, so you can find these online or on microfilm probably over at the Butler Center. This is the 1850 slave schedule. And like 1861, it shows the owner's name, the slave, not by name, but by age, sex, color, whether or not they're a fugitive, whether or not they've been manumitted, whether or not they're deaf and dumb, the terminology of the time. And on this page, I'm showing you Elijah Worthington. There's a pretty long list. I don't remember how many slaves he has in 1850, but in 1860 he had 543. He was the largest slaveholder in Arkansas and his 4 plantations. This is the 1860 schedule for Lycurgus. And it doesn't look like there's many there, but whoever was making this list is grouping individuals by age. So there's, I think it said 30 people who are 60 years of age. I think that's what it says. But anyway, they're grouped by age, so when you add all those numbers up, it reaches 155. And then, of course, we have tax records that you can find on microfilm, or you can come to the courthouse in Chicot County to look at. But this is the 1863 schedule, which shows there's only 24 slaves remaining at Lakeport, assessed at $12,000. So the Civil War is happening, and these slaves are leaving. And we have a lot of evidence that other planters were taking their slaves to Texas, but we don't have any evidence that Lycurgus was doing that. And there's also deeds. Here's a deed from 1832 where Joel Johnson is purchasing 23 slaves from I think it's his father-in-law, and then these are skilled workers, or include skilled workers, Bill a brickman, Thomas a carpenter, and Lewis a blacksmith. So that provides a little more detail. With the slave schedules, you don't even have names of individuals, so it's hard to connect people in 1870 to that list. But here we have the names of carpenters and other skilled workers. We also have other written sources. We don't have a whole lot of written sources for Lakeport in terms of family diaries or letters, but we do have this kind of a memoir written by the tutor for the family who was there in 1860 and early 61. And she wrote a letter to her father that gets republished in this family memoir, but also she gives her contemporary memories from about 1890. And she says there were 150 slaves who raised 1,200 acres of cotton and 300 acres of corn. And she also says later that in the family of Mr. Johnson, there were 7 or 8 house servants, including a well-trained dining room servant valued at $1,700, purchased the year before with his wife and child for a total of $3,000. So I think what she's trying to say there is that, obviously Mr. Johnson's wealthy, but he's also keeping a family together, and it's a house servant. So I don't know if Lycurgus would do the same thing for field slaves, but certainly for someone who's working in his dining room and waiting on his family, he's keeping that person somewhat happy, or not breaking up their family. I don't know if happy is the right word. We also have scrapbooks, I think 2 scrapbooks from different sides of the family that show what we think are former slaves. So this is Victor Johnson's scrapbook. Victor Johnson was Lycurgus's youngest son and the last Johnson to live in the house. And we have this picture that shows cooks of Miss Lydia Johnson, Mandy Thompson, and Fannie Dorsey. And then we have another picture that identifies a woman as Mamie Charlotte and says that she was a slave of Richard M. Johnson. And Richard M. Johnson was another uncle of Lycurgus, who was a Kentucky senator and a vice president of the United States under Martin Van Buren, and had a plantation in Chicot County. We think we know who she is, but we're not exactly sure how she got to Chicot County, whether she was at the plantation south of there or came up north. And then we have these one of those same pictures in a scrapbook, I think it comes from our Canadian descendants. And in that scrapbook, Mandy and Fanny are identified as former slaves of his father. I think we're talking about Victor on our plantation. And then we also have the picture that says Mandy's house, which we think you can see Lakeport in the background, but Mandy's house is probably an overseer's house that later gets used, is being used by Mandy. So we at least have this one caption right here that identifies these two ladies as former slaves and cooks of Lydia, and then that picture of Mammy Charlotte identifying her as a former slave as well. So Mammy Charlotte was probably Charlotte Mitchell. She shows up in the census in 1870, 1880, and 1900, 1910 in the area. So we can see in the census who her children were, and she's buried. She dies in 1912, according to this headstone. She's buried at Redleaf Plantation, which is not that far away. So this is probably her. So we're not getting her story, but we're kind of getting a little bit closer to it. We know that she's probably born in South Carolina. We can tell by the ages of her children and where they're born that it looks like they arrived in Arkansas probably in the late 1850s. And her being from South Carolina makes me wonder if she came with Elijah Worthington, because he bought a large number of slaves from South Carolina in the late 50s. But she could still be a former slave of Richard Wintory Johnson and be purchased by Elijah. But again, I don't have answers for that. I'm just speculating. But it looks like she's arriving in the late 50s. Because some of her kids are born in South Carolina, and some of her kids are born in Arkansas. And the census varies, about their ages and where they were born. It's just, the data is not perfect. And then, we've constructed kind of similar stories for Fannie Dorsey and Mandy Thompson, mostly based on the census. Here, a little caption. And most of these stories are incorporated into our exhibits at Lakeport. This is stuff that we've known for quite a while. But Fannie Dorsey is probably born in Kentucky. The year she born is kind of varies. Even the place could be North Carolina as well. She was likely married to Moses Dorsey. There's no marriage record, but in the census she is married to him. I don't think with her I found a whole lot of. Yeah, we do know some information about some of her children. Her and Moses had 3 kids: Louis Dorsey, Susan Dorsey, and Rachel, later Baker. So we know a little bit about them. And then here's Mandy, again, a different picture. And we actually have a marriage record for her in the courthouse. So she married Harvey Thompson in 1866 in December, and she was married by Lycurgus. One story says they were married on the front porch. And in 1870, she's in the Lakeport area. She's 22 years old. Her and Harvey have a son named Isaac. 1880, they're working on the farm, it says. And 1900, we couldn't find her. Or at least I couldn't find her. 1910, she's listed as a nurse. She's born in Arkansas, according to that. Her mother's living with her. They're both widowed. The mother's name is Cynthia Brown. And then 1920, she's listed as a private servant along with Thomas Handy, who's living in the household with her. But we have this, we can look in the courthouse and find this marriage record, and it turns out there are 10 couples. Here's my notes from writing in the courthouse. There are 10 couples who get married by Lycurgus in 1866 and 67. And we can connect about half these names to names on this list that I mentioned a minute ago. This is the inventory of Joel Johnson's estate in 1858. So we get a list of names of slaves. I believe it's 183 names. And then if I take this list and try to connect those names, I can make connections to I think 5 of the couples. Also included Louis and Eliza, which we think is another slave that we don't have a marriage record for, but they're in the area and likely are former slaves. So I feel like this is kind of like the first stage of trying to figure all this out and then trying to connect it to other resources. We also have the Freedmen's Bureau's correspondence. Captain E.G. Barker wrote to General Sprague and said, Lycurgus Johnson, as one of the wealthiest and best planters in Chicot County, is cultivating his plantation with the same set of hands he had before the war, minus 15 who had died or strayed or been stolen, and he's had all his crop cleared. This is quoted in Tom Black's dissertation. But I think this is kind of a strange quote because we can see in tax records where the number of slaves have gone down from 120 one year in the tax records to just 24 So when he's saying he's operating the same set of hands, is it, minus that 15 minus that 24, or 15 minus that 150? I just don't know exactly what numbers we're talking about here, but it's likely that some of those former slaves are still sharecropping. That makes sense. But I have a hard time reconciling, the number of 24. I don't think it's the 155. I don't think that's what we're referring to in this quote. So, trying to get closer down here to the enslaved perspective. Now, there are WPA narratives for Chicot County, but none that were recorded in Chicot County. They're all recorded in other parts of the state, and there are 7 individuals who were connected to Chicot County in some way. Most of these people were former slaves, but I think 2 of them, James Morgan was the son of slaves, and William Lattimore was born in Mississippi and then came to Chicot County probably in the 1880s. But I thought I'd go through a couple of these. Lucretia Alexander is the best narrative. It's the longest, the most detailed. She's 89 years old. She's in Little Rock. She's 12 years old on the Rossmere Plantation, which was kind of near where Stewart was. Actually, it's very near where Stewart was, that I quoted earlier. So she's there on the Rossmere Plantation. She gives a lot of details about the overseers on the plantation. She says that she gives a lot of detail about Tom Phipps and said that he was mean as he could be, and he once whipped her and aimed to kill her. There's some sort of dispute. Maybe Tom Phipps had a mulatto child of his own that was in competition with Lucretia or something, and he favored his own child, and he whipped Lucretia. But she was protected by her mistress, she says, Susan Chapman Reed, and that Phipps was ran off the plantation. And a lot of her memories really connect really well with the census. These names of overseers are in the census. And she also gives a story about when Union soldiers arrived on the plantation and announced that you're as free as I am. And she says that old colored folks, that was on sticks, on canes, throw those sticks away and shouted. So she gives it a nice narrative of what freedom was like and the exhilaration for that. She says she stayed on the plantation for 4 years and was paid $12 a month plus her food and clothing. And then later on she moved to Little Rock in 1923. I don't know what she does in the meantime. And then Fanny Johnson, she's interviewed in Hot Springs. But she was a slave on the Wood Fork Plantation in Grand Lake, which is south of Lakeport. And that she tells that her parents were born in Maryland, but they were brought from Nashville by Wood Fork, and that Wood Fork did not believe in separating families. So she says that after the war, they were taken by probably federal troops. She doesn't specify to the Bend, Jefferson Davis's plantation, where they probably were farming on confiscated land. And then she returns to Arkansas, and she lives in a variety of places. Jefferson County, she lives in Oklahoma, she lives in Eureka Springs and in Hot Springs. I think she says she's working as a cook in Hot Springs and Eureka Springs. This one's very short. Nannie Jones, she's in Pine Bluff. She's 81 years old. She was on Dr. Gaines' plantation, who was another Kentuckian. She's kind of the northern end of the county. She says that her mother was sold downriver and died when she was small. And then she says her father joined the Army. She didn't say the Union Army, Confederate Army. It's probably the Union Army. I don't know her maiden name, so I've had a hard time figuring out who her father was. Here's another Nannie. Nannie Madden. She's in West Memphis. She says she's born in Lake Village in 1867. She's not a former slave, but her parents were. And she doesn't say what her parents' name is, so it's hard to figure out who she is as well in the census and other documents. But she also says her father served in the Union Army. And there's a connection to Lakeport. They rented a farm at Redleaf, which was then being run by Isaac Worthington Jr., who was Lycurgus' son-in-law. So there is a connection to the Johnsons there. And then Mattie Nelson, what I like about hers is that she says that she was born around 1865 during her family's immigration from Texas. And she also points out that they were enslaved by the Chapmans that I mentioned earlier in Chicot County. And then later on, her parents stayed there with the Chapmans until they died. So this immigration, there are letters for Johnson, Chapman at the History Commission, or the State Archives now, in the Woodruff collection, from Johnson Chapman talking about how I'm leaving Chicot County, I'm taking all my slaves, or a number of my slaves, to East Texas. So she and her parents are some of those slaves that were taken to East Texas. And apparently she was born on the way back to Arkansas, born back to Chicot County. You go through like the 1870 census, you can find where there are kids born in Texas and parents born in Arkansas. So I've always wondered how many of these slaves that were taken to Texas made their way back to Arkansas, and why would you come back to Arkansas? Apparently some, wanted to come back. You can see that the census records are in this WPA record. So I've been, the past couple of years, I thought, well, those WPA records have very limited, they're limited. There's only 7 of them. They only tell us so much. So I've been trying to look at the pension records for U.S. colored troops, hoping to find former troops or former slaves at Lakeport. And this is kind of a needle in a haystack. I've kind of jumped into it, see what I can find, and make 2 trips to D.C. to look at these records. But it's another way for former slaves to tell their own story in their own words. They're collected decades before the WPA narrative, so the memories are stronger. And there are a lot of these pensions. And they tell the story, at least about 80,000 according to one estimate. But they tell the theme of, themes of slavery, or they can anyway, slavery, African-American military experience, civilian life during the Civil War, and their experiences of emancipation, and their post-war life as former slaves. So they don't all do that, but most of these records are at the National Archives. You can't order these. I ordered one, and it took 6 months for me to get it, so it's sometimes it's easier. Well, it's certainly easier to go there. But this is one record. This is a very thin one, but they can be very thick. They can be very thin. You just never know what you're getting until the packets arrive. But you can, I figured out before that there are ways of, figuring out who I want to look at. So there are these pension index cards. There are organizational, like, this is Richard Lewis. This is his organizational card. These are organized by their unit. And so he's in the, what is he in? He's in the, so he first joins the 10th Louisiana. That gets changed their name to 48th U.S. Colored Infantry. So this card right here is organized by what unit he was in. This other card is the card alphabetically. Sometimes the organizational cards will say where someone died. So Richard Lewis died in Eudora, Arkansas, which is in Chicot County. But if you look at this card, it looks like he was probably enslaved in Louisiana since he joined Louisiana. Not totally sure, but that actually was true for this case. Unfortunately, the organizational cards don't have all the information. You can see this C number down here. I call them C pensions because it's a later number. There's also these other numbers. He got a certificate, so he got a pension, so that 1046949, that was his pension number. But later on, they renumbered some of these active pension files, and you get the C number over here. So if you went to the National Archives and requested by his certificate number, you wouldn't get it. You didn't have that C number. Anyway, it's kind of the process. But U.S. colored troops, they started forming in 1862. But really, the dates that matter for Lakeport are 1863 when Lorenzo Thomas came to Lower Mississippi Valley to enlist colored troops. And we know from some estimates, not my estimates, that there are maybe as many as 77,700 troops that were enlisted in the Lower Mississippi Valley. And I don't know what they define Lower Mississippi Valley as. I don't know if that's Memphis to New Orleans or if it goes any higher. But that's a lot of individuals. There might be as many as 80,000 African American pension applications, so I don't know how many of that accounts for. Anyway, there's thousands of pension records that would come from the Lower Mississippi Valley probably. But people got pensions early on just for being disabled from their service or being dead, their dependents getting a pension. Later on, by 1890, any disability that you had just from old age, you could get a pension. By 1895, the pensions service accounted for 40% of the federal budget. And it's a mountain of records. So some of these records can be very, very narrow. They can have wonderful things like images of the pensioner, like this one right here from Washington County, Mississippi, John Gordon. Because most African Americans were illiterate, didn't have identity papers, a lot of times they needed special examinations. So they had to send special pension agents to their communities to interview them and their maybe former masters sometimes and neighbors to prove that this person is who they said they are. So if it turns into a special examination, it could be a wealth of data. If it was an easy one where they knew that this person's identity is certain, it could be a very simple and less rewarding for the historian. But there can be marriage license, former names of slave owners, and lots of depositions. I also try to connect these records with other records like the Freedmen's Bureau. So like that arrow I'm pointing to right there, that is Willis Jefferson married his wife Mary Jane Griffin in Vicksburg, and it says she is from Grand Lake. So she is from Chicot County. And it turns out he's also from Chicot County. They're from the Eudora area. Never returned to Chicot County. They ended up in Kentucky where they were from originally. But I tried to use records like that to kind of target individuals that might be interesting or might be from Lakeport or just from Chicot County. So here's another example. Andrew Garrett right there. He's in the 51st U.S. Colored Infantry, and he's marrying Jenny Garrett. And it says Ashland County. So I kind of figured Ashland County, Arkansas. I kind of figured that's probably Ashley County, Arkansas, which is the county next door to Chicot County. And when I looked at his pension, I was rewarded with a photograph, as well as a good section of his story. So this is Andrew Garrett right here. He is born in DeSoto County, Mississippi. It says he lived in Ashland, so that, again, that Ashley County gets corrupted somehow. So he's living in Ashley County, Arkansas prior to the war. He enlisted in Vicksburg in 1863, and he was discharged in Baton Rouge. And then when he was discharged, he lived a variety of places, not in Arkansas. So he lived in Alabama, he lived in Mississippi, he moved to Memphis, and then Oklahoma. And then later on, he had another marriage to Sarah Freeman, and then he died in Oklahoma City. So there are not many pictures in these pension files, and so I found 4 pension files on 4 pictures in my last trip. So let's get his own words. He says, when I enlisted in the Army, my master's name was Eli Garrett. He's now dead, in Asheville County, Arkansas. For that reason, I enlisted in the name of Garrett. My former master was Jimmy Maxwell, who's also dead, in DeSoto County, Mississippi. His daughter married Mr. Garrett, and that is how I passed to the Garretts. I have been married 3 times. My first wife, Jenny, who we saw on the marriage record in Vicksburg, married on the Maxwell plantation before the war, and married her again in Vicksburg. After a while I was in the Army, she left me for another man. So, unfortunately for him, or maybe not. But there's more in this pension file, but that's we get his biography from that. This one's really hard to see. This is George Combs. He's in the 5th U.S. Heavy Artillery, Company K, and he's born in Tennessee. And there's actually 3 people in this picture. I don't know if y'all can tell. There's a person in the background. I'm assuming that's him, and this is his wife, Jordana, I think. But they were a refuge to. So he's owned by Tom Combs. He ended up at the White River at another plantation during the Civil War near Clarendon, and then he escaped and made it to Vicksburg. I think he makes it to Helena, Vicksburg, and enlists. And he married Agnes, sometimes Georgiana Huggins, at Milliken's Bend in Louisiana. And then he lives in Louisiana, he moves back to Arkansas, and then he dies in Chicot County. Here's his words. He says, during the war, I was refugeed on the White River near to Clarendon above Duval's Bluff to a plantation that he got a hold of, his owner. There were a lot of slaves that he took out there from the Yankees. My other was Marie. Father Jake had one brother, Horace Combs. Have never heard of him since the war. I do not know whether he was in the Army. He left me at Helena and went to Memphis during the war. Myself and Horace, my brother, ran away from the place on the White River and made our way to Helena, Arkansas. We were going back to our old boss to McNairy County. Young boss John Combs was there at the time. I ran away. When we got to Helena, we found the Yankees there, and they took us. We tried to dodge them and get home. I think that's what I'm saying, but could not. We stayed there about a month, and then they carried us on transports to Vicksburg. So here's a guy who reluctantly joined the U.S. military. But there's another view. I know it's really hard to see. And I've touched it up so it looks better than it did when I first scanned it in. And here's Robert Gillam. We have 2 pictures of him. But he was in the 48th U.S. Colored Infantry, born in Louisville, Kentucky. He enlisted in Vicksburg in '63, so a lot of these guys are enlisted in Vicksburg. He mustered out in New Orleans, and he lived near Pendleton, which I think is Arkansas County, until 1873, and he died in Deschutes County at Walnut. So he says, I do not know my age, and I do not know what year I was born. I was bred and born in Old Kentucky in Louisville. I was born a slave of Tom Helen. He died and we were sold to Bill Green. He was my owner when we enlisted. I had been with him 16 years before the war. He lived on Big Black, what is now West Station, about 50 miles from Vicksburg. So he was not a slave in Arkansas like the other two that lived in Arkansas. That's a nice picture of him. He looks... What was the other picture? It looks like he's maybe on his farm, or his house in the other picture. But I thought I'd finish up with two examples of ones that are closer to Lakeport, kind of the closest I've come to Lakeport. So I've come across this group I'm calling the Sunnyside group. They were all in the 49th U.S. Colored Infantry. And you can see from one of their index cards right here, Charles Dottie died in Lake Village. But it turns out none of them were from Arkansas, but they all came to Arkansas later. So Charles Dottie and Stephen Watson's pension, they all get interviewed in each other's pensions, so it's kind of fun to put them all together. But he says, I was mustered out in Vicksburg, and that night started for Sunnyside, Arkansas, which is where Elijah Worthington's plantation was. Yellow Day White, Stephen Watson was in the crowd, as there were about 60 of us. We came to chop wood. So it sounds like a bunch of these guys, maybe as many as 60, came as a large group to chop wood along the river in Chicot County at Sunnyside. And so out of this group, Adam White becomes a sharecropper at Lakeport. He says, my name is Adam White, age about 60. He's unable to work. He resides at Lakeport Plantation with his post office at Sunnyside. So he tells us where he was born and where he was enslaved. I was born in Kentucky, but was brought to Louisiana to East Carroll Parish when I was very young by James Curry, who was my master, and stayed on his place until I enlisted. So this is not perfect. There's not a whole lot of information here, but we get a very short general affidavit from Cave Johnson, another one of Lycurgus' sons. And he says, during the last 10 years, Adam White has worked for me. Previous to that time, he worked on this place for my father from 1870 to 1889 when I took charge of the business. So I get a connection to Lakeport. There's actually another guy who's also a sharecropper on Lakeport. And I was looking at this pension again last night. There's a lot of other affidavits for other individuals at Lakeport. They don't seem to be slaves, former slaves at Lakeport. I think one guy was from a nearby plantation in Louisiana that he knew had done for a long time. And then there's this guy right here with this funny name, Lycurgus Johnson, a former slave. So this is the one that took me 6 months to get because I didn't know about it when I was in D.C. the first time, so I ordered it and it took 6 months. But this guy's name is Lycurgus Johnson. His widow married Covington. And one of his minor sons, I think we figured out it's his room, are filing for a pension. You see, he does not file for a pension, but his widow is, and then his minor child. And they did not get a pension because there's no number over here. But despite that, it's quite a large file. I can look at his service records and see that he, what does it say? He's born. What does it say? He enlisted at Lake Providence, so he's not too far from Lakeport. Maybe he made his way down. And then it says where he joined down here. I think he dies during the war. That's why he is not filing for this pension. But we get depositions from his wife and his sons in this pension, and she doesn't get a pension basically because she had remarried. That's why she was not eligible. And her sons were not eligible because they were past the age of eligibility. So turns out that this Lycurgus Johnson was not a slave at Lakeport, but he was a slave across the river. And this deposition by Mary Covington tells us that. So she says that they were a slave of Edward P. Johnson on the Ivan place across the river from Lakeport. And Edward P. Johnson was one of Lycurgus' cousins across the river. And they were brought there from Kentucky, and that they met on the plantation, and that's where they married. I don't think there was it was a slave marriage. It was not a courthouse marriage later on. Of course, he died in the war, so not possible. But here is in relation to Lakeport. Here's Lakeport. This plantation that he is from is over here at Edward Johnson's at Ivan Plantation. And then these depositions, we learned that the family kind of moves around to other plantations. They're at Refuge for a while. They're at the Hollywood Plantation and at Swiftwater in this area. So they didn't move too far from where they were enslaved, her and her sons. But she also, we've got some questions now, like why does he have this name Lycurgus? And we don't get a very good answer from Mary. She said, I never knew Lycurgus' father, mother, or brother or sister. Never heard what caused their death. So they're very focused on what caused Lycurgus' death. That he died because of something in the Civil War, or was he always sick? It turns out he was always sick. He had consumption or tuberculosis likely. But he says that he wanted to go into the army because everyone else was doing it. I mean, that's kind of what she says there. And she had not seen him since he was at Lake Providence, so she followed him also to his he was stationed. And then she also gives some description about where she was. Her second marriage is Sam Covington, which we can find records in the courthouse over in Mississippi. She also describes his illnesses, that he was always spitting out blood. Some of his kids also had the same illness. But we do find a marriage record for them in Vicksburg, and it does tell us information that they're mulatto, that his father was white. So the kind of question we always have is, is his father Lycurgus, our Lycurgus? And it looks like they are too close in age for that to be a possibility. Lycurgus was born 1828, and this Lycurgus, this soldier Lycurgus, is born within 10 years of our Lycurgus. So. But it's very possible that he was just giving an honorific name for other members of the white family. And it turns out that Edward Johnson had a brother named Leonidas Lycurgus Johnson, who was the cousin of Lakeport's Lycurgus, Leonidas Johnson. And unfortunately, the questions just never don't narrow in to tell us the answer to how he got his name. Mary says that I never knew Lycurgus' father and mother or what caused their death, so it's just. So this is my conclusion right here. I have lots more examples, but I definitely don't have time for all these other examples. So Lakeport's story can't be told without the voices of the former enslaved. And with limited sources for their voices, I think that pension files can help provide a wealth of new data that can help us better tell the story of Lakeport and the people who lived and worked there. But they also present a lot of challenges for researching. It's not, it takes time and money to get to DC. I need a better research strategy. I need to understand which units I need to look at. It turns out, I think I've decided that the 47th is probably a good one to focus on better. But then once I've looked at about 120 pension files together, so I've got just all kinds of data that I haven't really had a chance to go through completely and organize and think through, or sift through, as I say there. So with that, I can take questions or